He gave his last horse and the Apache returned with 70 warriors. The evening fire crackled softly in the gathering dusk, sending golden sparks dancing upward into the star-scattered sky. Around its warm circle, the faces of 7 friends glowed in the flickering light, their weathered features softened by the flames and the easy comfort of shared stories. The desert air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp, a coyote called to its pack. Samuel Hayes sat with his back against a smooth boulder, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. His eyes, the color of winter sky, reflected the firelight as he gazed into the flames. The others, Maria, Joseph, Thomas, Catherine, Michael, and old Benjamin had been sharing tales of their travels, of narrow escapes and unexpected kindnesses found on the long trails that crisscrossed this vast territory. "Tell us about the Apache, Samuel," Maria said softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling wood. "About what happened at Devil's Canyon." Samuel's weathered face grew thoughtful, the lines around his eyes deepening as memory carried him back to that day 3 months past. He set down his cup and leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a man who had learned that some stories required careful telling. "It was the kind of morning that makes a man grateful to be alive," he began, his words slow and deliberate. The sky was clear as spring water, and the air had that crisp bite that tells you winter's finally loosening its grip on the high country. I was traveling north toward the settlement at Pine Ridge, leading my pack horse through Devil's Canyon. You all know the place, where the walls rise up like cathedral spires on both sides. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks skyward, and Samuel paused to let the sound fade before continuing. "I'd been riding for 3 days straight, and my supplies were running low. Just hardtack and jerky left, barely enough water to see me through another day. But I had my horses, my faithful mare, Stella, who'd carried me through more scrapes than I care to count, and Thunder, my pack horse, big bay gelding, strong as an ox and gentle as a lamb." Samuel's voice grew quieter, and the others leaned in unconsciously, drawn by the intimacy of his tone. "It was Thunder I saw first in the canyon that morning, standing alone near the far wall, saddled and bridled but riderless. At first, I thought maybe his rider had taken ill, or perhaps stepped away to tend to some business. But as I rode closer, I saw the truth of it." He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "There was an Apache warrior there, young man, maybe 25 or 30 years old. He was sitting in the shade of an overhang, and I could see right away that he was in bad shape. His leg was bent wrong, clearly broken, and his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. His own horse was nowhere to be seen, must have spooked and run off after he took his fall." The fire settled with a soft whisper, and in the momentary quiet they could hear the distant sound of wind moving through the canyon walls. "Now, I'd heard all the stories same as everyone else," Samuel continued, "about Apache raids and settlers going missing. Fear runs deep in these parts, and most folks would have ridden wide around a situation like that. But looking at that young man, all I could see was another human being in need of help." Catherine shifted slightly, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the cooling air. "What did you do, Samuel?" "I dismounted, slow and easy, keeping my hands where he could see them. Spoke to him in what little Apache I'd picked up over the years, mostly just simple words, but enough to let him know I meant no harm. He watched me with these dark eyes, wary as a cornered wolf, but he didn't reach for his weapons." Samuel's voice took on a gentle rhythm like water flowing over smooth stones. "I could see he was studying me, trying to figure out what kind of man I was, and I suppose I was doing the same with him. His name, I learned, was Nashoba, means wolf in his language. Seemed fitting, given that watchful way he had about him." The storyteller reached for a stick and poked at the fire, sending up another cascade of sparks before settling back against his boulder. "I spent the better part of that day with Nashoba, set his leg as best I could with what supplies I had, shared my water and what little food remained. We didn't talk much, partly because of the language barrier, partly because pain has its own way of making a man quiet. But there was an understanding between us, you know, the kind that doesn't need words." Thomas nodded slowly. "I've felt that before, with folks you meet on the trail sometimes." "Exactly right, Thomas." It was late afternoon when I realized the full scope of his predicament. His people had moved on following the seasonal migration, as was their way. With his injury, there was no chance he could catch up to them on foot. He was stranded, maybe 100 miles from the nearest help, in country that could kill a healthy man. Samuel paused, his eyes distant with memory. "That's when I made my decision. I helped him. Onto Thunder's back took some doing. with that broken leg and sent him on his way north, in the direction his people had gone. Gave him my water skin, my remaining supplies, everything I could spare. Maria's eyes widened in the firelight. You gave him your pack horse, your supplies. I did indeed. Left me with just Stella and whatever was in my saddlebags, barely enough to see me through to Pine Ridge, and that only if everything went perfectly. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of night-blooming desert flowers, and the fire flames danced in response. Now, I won't lie to you folks. As I watched Thunder disappear into the canyon shadows with Nashoba on his back, I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. All the stories folks tell about Apache warriors, about what happens to white men who cross their paths. Those thoughts had a way of circling back through a man's mind. Benjamin, who had been silent throughout the tale, finally spoke. But you did it anyway. I did it anyway, because sometimes a man has to choose between his fears and his conscience. And I'd rather face whatever came than live with the knowledge that I'd left another human being to die in the desert. Samuel stood and walked to the edge of their camp circle, gazing out into the star-filled darkness before returning to his place by the fire. The journey to Pine Ridge took me 2 days longer than planned. Had to go slow, conserve water, let Stella rest more than usual. By the time I reached the settlement, both of us were worn thin, but we made it, and I figured that was the end of the story. He smiled then, an expression that transformed his weathered features. 3 weeks later, I was preparing to head back south, had some business to attend to in Tucson. I'd acquired another pack horse, not Thunder's equal, but a decent animal, and was loading supplies when I heard a commotion at the edge of town. Joseph leaned forward. What kind of commotion? Riders approaching, a lot of them, from the sound of it. The whole town went quiet, folks peering out of windows and doorways, and then I saw them. Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and the others had to strain to hear him over the crackling fire. 70 Apache warriors, riding in perfect formation across the desert floor. At their head was Nashoba, sitting straight and proud on Thunder's back, his broken leg healed enough for him to ride. They came to a stop maybe 50 yards from the town's edge, and for a long moment, nobody moved. The fire popped loudly in the silence, making several of the listeners jump. Then Nashoba rode forward, alone. He stopped right in front of me and dismounted slowly, favoring that healing leg. Without a word, he handed me Thunder's reins. My horse looked good, well cared for, maybe even better fed than when I'd last seen him. Samuel's eyes grew bright with the memory, but that wasn't all. Nashoba gestured to his warriors, and they began bringing forward gifts. Beautiful blankets woven with patterns I'd never seen before, a saddle decorated with silver concos that must have taken months to create, turquoise jewelry that caught the afternoon sun like captured sky, more than I could possibly carry. Catherine pressed her hand to her heart. They came back to thank you. They came back to honor a debt. In Nashoba's culture, the debt I'd created by saving his life could only be repaid with interest, but it was more than that. Through Nashoba, his people were making a statement about the kind of man they believed me to be. Samuel stood again and walked to where his horse was picketed in the shadows beyond the firelight. When he returned, he carried a beautifully crafted Apache saddle, its leather dark with age and care, silver concos gleaming in the firelight. This is the saddle they gave me that day. I've carried it ever since, not just because it's a thing of beauty, but because it reminds me of something important. He set the saddle down carefully and returned to his place by the fire. You see, when I gave Nashoba my horse, I thought I was making a sacrifice, thought I was giving up something valuable to help a stranger. But what I learned that day in Pine Ridge was that what I'd actually done was plant a seed of trust, of understanding between two peoples who had every reason to fear each other. The desert night settled around them like a blanket, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate. Nashoba and we became friends after that. Real friends, despite coming from different worlds. He taught me things about this land that I never would have learned otherwise: how to read the weather in the way grass moves, where to find water in country that looks bone dry, which plants can heal and which can harm. Samuel's voice grew soft with affection, and I like to think I taught him a few things too. About trust between strangers, about the possibility that people who look different and speak different languages might still share the same hopes for peace and understanding. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a gentler, warmer light over the circle of friends. The Apache warriors who rode with Nashoba that day, they didn't come to make war, they came to make peace, at least with one white man who had shown their brother kindness. And in doing so, they showed me that the stories we tell ourselves about other people, the fears we carry about those who are different from us, Those stories aren't always true. Michael, who had been quiet throughout the tale, finally spoke. What happened to Nashoba after that? Samuel smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. Nashoba and I, we stayed in touch over the years. He'd stop by whenever his people's travels brought them near wherever I happened to be. Always brought gifts, always shared news of his family. Last time I saw him, he had 3 children and a wife who makes the finest pottery you've ever seen. The coals pulsed with warmth, and the night air carried the promise of dawn still hours away. So when people ask me about that day in Devil's Canyon, about why I gave away my last horse to an Apache warrior, I tell them this: sometimes the smallest act of kindness, the simplest choice to see another person's humanity instead of their differences, can change everything. Not just for them, but for you too. Samuel looked around the circle at his friends, their faces peaceful in the dying firelight. I gave away 1 horse that day and got back so much more. I got friendship, I got wisdom, I got a story worth telling, but most of all, I got the knowledge that there's more good in this world than bad, more reason for hope than for fear. Sometimes you just have to be willing to take the first step. The fire settled into glowing embers, and the desert night embraced them all in its ancient, patient silence. And in that silence, 7 friends sat with full hearts, carrying with them the truth that Samuel Hayes had learned in Devil's Canyon, that kindness, once given freely, has a way of returning 7-fold, like seeds planted in good soil under an endless sky.